Caribe Radio nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.
Los conceptos, productos y servicios del siguiente espacio son responsabilidad del director del programa y no representan el pensamiento de esta emisora.
Good afternoon. This is Conversations with Authors, part of Books Over Drinks, a literary community dedicated to foster a passion for books and provide a platform for both authors and readers to exchange ideas and discuss their work. We're pleased to welcome Sam Kean. He is a best-selling author with 6 fascinating books and multiple writings for publications like Nature, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Slate, and Psychology Today, among others. His writings mostly focus on the intersection between humans and science, and he joins us today to discuss his latest book, The Icepick Surgeon: Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. This is a fascinating book that combines science with true crime and serves readers with stories of horrifying crimes perpetrated by those who pursued scientific discovery, no matter the cost of life or suffering. Some went down in history as monsters, with their discoveries and contributions being casted aside, while others were simply assimilated by the ever-growing repository of scientific knowledge. Regardless of their true natures or their true motivations, they all converge in a misguided belief that the end justifies the means, and over-rationalizations to justify their terrible actions. The book dedicates each chapter to a specific crime, from murder to sabotage to fraud and others, serving readers with a heavy dose of reality about the backstories of those who suffered at the hand of men of science, some of which did not abide by or simply distorted the meaning of the Hippocratic oath they took. All in all, the author's highly engaging read and masterful storytelling skills gives us a fascinating book, yet one filled with stories difficult to wrap our heads around, making it hard to reconcile the idea of scientific discovery being laid on top of such cruelty and mischief. Sam, it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, so why don't we get started with to know a little bit more about you. You've been writing extensively about the intersection of humans and science, but for those who may not be yet familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to focus on the history of science and what led you to write this book, The Icepick Surgeon?
Yeah, so my books in general often focus on the stories behind science. So there are heroes and villains involved. There's conflict and drama. All the things that make a good, juicy story are the things I try to include in my books. It just happens to be about science and scientists. So rivalries, all those kinds of juicy things. And I just always have loved the history of science. I was actually a physics major in college, so I have a technical background. But I guess what I really gravitated toward was the stories about the scientists themselves, their lives, their discoveries, things they had to overcome, stuff like that. And I've written 6 books at this point about a variety of topics. One is all about the periodic table, one about the human genome, the human brain, etc. With this book, it's a little different in that with my other books, I try to have a lot of fun with the stories. There's a lot of lighthearted moments, a little laughter. This one does have a bit of a darker edge. Like you said, it's kind of true crime fused with science. And I was really obsessed with this idea of scientists who got so excited or so obsessed themselves with some topic that they just took things way, way too far. They started trampling ethical boundaries and even committing crimes in the name of science. And I was intrigued by that because usually we think about the pursuit of knowledge about science as a good thing. And usually it is a good thing. But in some cases, it gets twisted in this very dark way. And that's what these scientists ended up doing. So it's a collection of stories about men and women who, again, pushed things too far and committed crimes in the name of science.
You spoke about rivalries, and one of the best examples in your book, I believe, are those that take a dark turn. When you spoke about Edison turning to animal cruelty, and ended up having his team torture and kill 44 dogs, 6 cats, 2 horses in his quest to discredit the alternating current and his rival George Westinghouse. Edison even pushed for the use of the electric chair as a main capital punishment. And that also seemed to be rooted in his rivalry against Westinghouse. Can you tell us a little bit about this story?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people generally know about Thomas Edison, the light bulb, the phonograph, all that kind of stuff. And if you know a little bit more about him, you might know about his rivalry with George Westinghouse and also Nikola Tesla, the very famous scientist. So essentially, Edison pushed the idea of DC, or direct current, whereas Tesla and Westinghouse favored alternating current, or AC. And at the time, late 1800s, there was a big rivalry. No one knew whether AC or DC was going to triumph in the marketplace. And Edison had all the patents on DC, was really pushing for it, but he knew that AC, for various technological reasons, had an advantage. And he was worried about this. So what he decided to do was and it's hard to hear sometimes, but he decided to take a bunch of animals, dogs, horses, things like that, hook them up to alternating current generators and essentially electrocute them, torture them, kill them in order to show, supposedly, that alternating current was much more deadly. And he would hold public demonstrations of this where he had lectures of people there. He would invite reporters over to do this, things like that. It was really, really awful looking back on this, the kind of things he did just to win out in the market. And as you said, this even led him to support the electric chair, the very first electric chair, which was built in New York State in the United States. Before this, Edison was a determined opponent of the death penalty. He opposed the death penalty. But when he saw a chance to discredit Tesla and Westinghouse, he jumped at it because he decided to push for the death penalty, the electric chair, and make sure that they use an alternating current generator to do this. So he was even willing to get into executions in order to discredit his business rival. So I don't know if it was ideological on Westinghouse's part, but he definitely didn't want his generators used in the electric chair. And his company rightly said, we're not selling these to you for the electric chair. So Edison sent one of his lackeys around, one of his assistants around, to find some used ones. And they actually got the serial numbers and they scraped off the serial numbers so they couldn't trace them to make sure no one could figure out Edison had bought them, blah, blah, blah. But they did end up using alternating current generators in the first attempt at the electric chair, which was actually, as I explained in the book, a disaster. It did not work very well. A lot of pain, a lot of suffering in there. So it ended up being a complete fiasco, but it did end up harming Westinghouse's reputation to some degree.
So in your book, you cover stories ranging from, I believe, to be the 17th century to just decades ago, but there doesn't seem to be any recent examples in your book. Do you think that as a society, we've developed enough safeguards to prevent science from trumping basic rights and liberties? Even animals you mentioned in your book have gained legal rights. Or are there any contemporary examples you believe should have made it in your book?
There are a few contemporary examples. There is one from the 2010s, so there is that example. And at the end of the book, I actually have an appendix that talks about crime in the future. So how we could use genetic engineering to commit new types of crimes, how artificial intelligence could be used to commit new types of crimes, things like that, space exploration, new types of crimes that could arise there. So the book does look at some contemporary things and does look to the future. And I do work very hard to make sure that even if it's a topic from the 1700s, it shows the connections to things today. So something like vaccine hesitancy, people not wanting to get vaccinated for various reasons. You can draw direct lines between that and abuses that happened in the past or other scandals, contemporary scandals. So I do work hard to make those connections. But I think you do raise a good point, which is that we do have more safeguards in place nowadays I think it's harder to get some of these unethical experiments through because we have things like institutional review boards. We have a little bit more scrutiny of science in the press and other places. Hospitals are watching these kind of things a little more closely. So it's certainly not impossible, but there are some things that safeguards that are in place in order to make sure that these things are harder to do nowadays. Now, all that said, recently, there was an example in China where they used CRISPR, the gene editing technology, to edit a few embryos. And the scientist who did this took a lot of criticism for it and is actually in jail now for doing that work. So you do every now and then see contemporary cases pop up, as I explained in the book.
Now, one of the chapters covers resurrectionists and the don't ask, don't tell policy anatomists had at the time when they sought their services to meet the high demand of medical students who needed corpses to study and map the inner workings of our bodies. Can you tell us how pervasive this practice was worldwide and how it was ultimately eradicated?
Yeah, it was pretty widespread pretty much anywhere they had a good, solid medical school, they would have people doing this. So to explain a little bit what was going on here, back in the 1700s to 1800s, there was a lot of tension between doctors and regular everyday people. Doctors needed human bodies to train on. They needed to study anatomy. They needed to know the inner workings of the body in order to help people and cure diseases. The problem was very few people at the time donated their bodies to science. So doctors basically had no way to get bodies in order to study medicine. So there was this tension there between these two groups. And what the doctors decided to do was they decided to start robbing graves. They would hire groups of professionals, they called them resurrectionists, or among other names, who would go out at night into graveyards and they would dig the body up and then they would drag it back to the doctor so that the doctor could dissect it and could train their students on how the human body works. But as you can imagine, regular everyday people did not like this. They did not like having their loved ones' bodies stolen out of the grave and then cut up into pieces. So there was a lot of tension there, a lot of anger there. And sometimes this would even boil over to the point where the regular everyday people would form mobs and they would march around to hospitals. And they would smash windows and they would chase after the doctors and they would beat people up. They called them the anatomy riots. And it happened again and again in different places around the world. And these tensions have sort of decreased nowadays in a lot of places because people do donate their bodies to science, but not everywhere. There are still shortages of bodies in some places, and you still see this tension where people don't have to, but they do rob graves, steal bodies, like things like that, in order to get enough bodies so that doctors can get their training to help people and cure diseases.
Now, in your book, you present readers with the question of whether we should use these data obtained through unethical means to further scientific discovery. Giving an example of the data produced by Nazi Germans around the topic of hypothermia, for example. But the answer to your question seems to be we are, or we have, haven't we? So how much of the science today is rooted in unethical practices of the past and human suffering like slavery?
Well, there's a couple different things to kind of tease apart there. In the slavery chapter, I talk about the roots of modern science and how a lot of it, especially biology, natural history, that sort of area, was kind of based on the transatlantic slave trade. In that if you were, a biologist and you wanted to go to South America or you wanted to go to Africa to study the plants and animals there, it was very, very hard to get to those places unless you hitched a ride on a slave ship. And when you got down there, there weren't many places where, a European or someone could live unless you were living in a slaving town. And the economy was based on slavery. So these people would get very intertwined in slavery. And you can trace the roots of a lot of modern science back to the slave trade. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is usually medical experiments where people did unethical things in that they essentially tortured people, made them suffer, and did not get their consent to do these things. The most notorious example being in Nazi Germany during World War II. And I explain this in the book very clearly, and it should be made clear that most of the experiments that the Nazis did were not only unethical, they were scientifically useless as well. So there's no reason to look at these things. There's no reason to use any of this information because it's not medically useful. But there were a couple of cases, as hypothermia being the best example, where the Nazis did get data on how to revive people who were extremely hypothermic. Their body temperatures had dropped a lot, well below the normal temperatures. And the Nazis figured out ways to revive them. So the question in the medical community has been, well, do we use this information on how best to revive people and actually save lives, or do we ignore it because it was obtained in an unethical way? And no one's claiming that this was an ethical experiment, but they do wonder, once we have this data, should we use it or not? And there's a lot of doctors who fall on both sides of this issue because, it's a tricky ethical issue. There's a lot of cases, again, where it's not a tricky ethical issue, but this is one case where it does make you wonder.
Absolutely. Now, the title of your book summarizes its premise as men who committed terrible deeds on behalf of scientific discovery. Yes, some of their motivations seem far more complex when you describe them in your book. Yes, you made the case for people like William Damper being driven to piracy as the only means to explore the world. But also covered Thomas Edison's work against Westinghouse, which was rooted more on like corporate greed. And people like Walter Freeman and John Money, whose motivations seem to be more driven like by ego or like a God complex. Is it safe to say that some of these motivations are far more complex than just rooted in science?
Yeah, so I think everyone in the book was driven by science on some level, and that they wanted to discover something. They wanted to advance the field. But in some cases, there were, as you said, other motivations mixed in. People are complex. We have multiple motivations sometimes. So I do think there was a genuine desire on these people's part to advance science. But as you said, sometimes people get a little complicated. Things get mixed in. So it is a mix in some cases of motivations.
I thought it was definitely a big mix of personalities and background stories to all these people, and definitely stories that, while the majority of people may not be aware of these or who these people were, I think we should all know for sure. So this is certainly a fascinating book, and one that we hope that everyone enjoys. The book is called The Icepick Surgeon: Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. It is by Sam Kean. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you back.
Okay, thanks for having me. Talk to you later.
Caribe Radio, nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.